John sat by the window of his apartment, staring blankly at the world outside. The city pulsed with life, people rushing by, cars honking in the distance, the hum of activity that he used to feel a part of. Now, it all felt distant, like he was watching someone else's life unfold. His own had become a quiet, oppressive rhythm. The same coffee, the same worn-out chair by the window, the same empty hours stretching into nothingness. He had once been someone who believed in possibility, in adventure, in dreams that could be chased and caught. But now, those dreams felt as though they had evaporated into the ether, leaving behind only the hollow echo of what might have been. His hands fidgeted with a crumpled piece of paper. It was an old draft of a novel, a story he'd once been so passionate about, something he had believed could change his life. There had been a time when his fingers moved across the keys with a fire, with an energy that made him feel alive. But now, when he looked at the pages, they seemed like the remnants of a person he no longer recognized. What had happened to him? What had happened to the man who used to pour his soul into the written word? The words on the page seemed foreign now, as though they had been written by someone else. The passion that once fueled his every sentence was nowhere to be found. He couldn't even remember the last time he had sat down to write. It wasn't just the novel that had slipped away. It was his entire sense of self. He had stopped trying to be the person he once dreamed of becoming. The world had demanded too much, and somewhere along the way, he had lost his fire, his vision. Dreams, it seemed, were fragile things, fleeting, delicate, and all too easy to lose. John stood up and walked to the small kitchen, opening the refrigerator to find nothing but empty shelves. Even the act of making a meal felt like a chore now, a reminder of how little he cared for the basic tasks of life. His reflection in the microwave door startled him. The man who looked back at him had a tired face, a hollow look in his eyes. There was no spark left in him, no drive. His hair was longer than it had been in years, and his clothes had begun to accumulate wrinkles from being worn day after day. When had it all stopped mattering? He thought about the past, the days when he had ambition, when he could see his life unfolding in front of him like a series of vivid chapters. There had been a time when he had dreams, when he had known exactly where he was going. He had been a writer, a creator, someone who could turn his thoughts into something tangible, something beautiful. But somewhere along the way, life had blurred the lines, and the path had become a maze. And now he couldn't even remember the last time he had been excited about anything. His phone buzzed on the counter, snapping him out of his thoughts. He looked at the screen, but it was just another spam message. He had stopped answering calls months ago, stopped responding to messages. What was the point? The people who reached out to him were all living lives that seemed to be moving forward, growing, evolving, while he remained stagnant, tethered to the same spot. The world had passed him by, and it didn't even seem to notice. He turned away from the phone, returning to the window. The city outside moved, lived, breathed, while he stood still. Was it too late to find a new purpose? Had he missed his chance? The thought gnawed at him like an invisible weight. He couldn't help but feel like he had missed something crucial, some key to unlocking his own potential. The dream he once held close had slipped through his fingers, and now he wasn't even sure if he could catch it again. What if it was too late? John pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the window, watching the blur of life outside. For the first time in what felt like ages, he allowed himself to ask the question aloud, though no one was there to hear it. What now? It was a question that echoed in his mind, bouncing off the walls of his soul, unanswered. What now? What was left when everything you once dreamed of felt like a memory slipping away, out of reach? The sound of the city below grew louder, the cars and voices blending into a chaotic symphony of life. But for John, it was all just noise, a reminder of how disconnected he had become. He used to be part of it, part of the world outside, part of something bigger than himself. Now, it all felt too far away. The dream of who he had been, and who he might still become, seemed as intangible as the air outside his window. And in that moment, he wondered if he could ever find his way back to who he once was. The cafe was small, tucked away on a quiet street corner where the world moved at a slower pace. A place where time seemed to drift as easily as the coffee aromas that filled the air. John had wandered into it out of habit, more to escape the silence of his apartment than to seek anything specific. The sun streamed through the windows, casting golden slivers of light across the worn wooden floors and the mismatched furniture. It was a cozy, almost familiar place, a contrast to the sterile, emotionless space he had retreated to for so long. He settled into a corner where the low hum of quiet conversation and the occasional clink of ceramic against wood provided a soft soundtrack. He didn't want to be noticed, didn't want to make small talk with anyone. A cup of coffee was all he needed to sit in peace, to let his thoughts slip back into the nothingness where they had resided for weeks, months even. The cafe was busier than usual, and as John sipped his coffee, he noticed a figure at the counter, a man hunched over a laptop, his brow furrowed in concentration. He wasn't dressed in anything particularly eye-catching, just a simple t-shirt and jeans, but there was something oddly familiar about him. It was the kind of face you saw in passing, one you might mistake for someone you'd known long ago. But it wasn't until the man turned his head slightly, just enough to catch John's eye, that he realized where he had seen him before. Matt Damon. John's heart skipped a beat, not out of fanboy excitement, but from the quiet realization that he was, indeed, sitting in a cafe across from a man who had achieved everything, at least, everything the world seemed to think mattered. He had fame, fortune, admiration. He had lived a life that most could only dream of. John stared at him for a moment, unsure if he was imagining it. It wasn't until Matt stood up to stretch and caught John's gaze directly that the connection was made. Their eyes locked for a brief moment, and it was as if an invisible thread was pulled between them. Matt offered a small, almost imperceptible nod, nothing overt, just a gesture of acknowledgement, and returned to his seat. John hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to approach. He wasn't a fan of celebrity culture, nor was he particularly inclined to strike up random conversations with strangers, especially someone who had every reason to want to remain anonymous. But there was something about the man's presence, something that felt grounded, despite the star power that surrounded him. Before he could think too much about it, his legs carried him across the room. It was a strange, involuntary motion, like the pull of something outside of his control. Matt looked up as John approached, his eyes kind, though cautious. "Hey," he said, voice warm but not overly enthusiastic, a man who had seen more than enough people approach him for the sake of his fame. But something in his expression softened when he saw John wasn't a typical fan. "Mind if I sit?" John asked, voice coming out quieter than he intended. There was a strange vulnerability in asking a complete stranger for permission to sit at their table, but Matt simply nodded, gesturing to the empty seat across from him. As John sat down, he couldn't help but feel both nervous and strangely comforted. The gap between them, which felt immense at first, began to shrink as they exchanged a few pleasantries. It was awkward. It was strange how easily the conversation flowed after that. They talked about nothing in particular, about nothing of any great importance, and yet it felt like the kind of conversation that had weight to it. Like every word carried some unspoken depth, some shared understanding. Matt shared a little about his current work, his life outside of the public eye. He spoke with a level of openness, but there was something measured in his words, carefully chosen, as though he had learned over time how to protect the parts of himself that mattered most. John, in turn, spoke about his own struggles, though not directly. He mentioned how he used to write, how he used to dream of making a difference with his words, but it all seemed so distant now, a faded memory he wasn't sure he could reach anymore. There was no judgment in Matt's eyes, no patronizing smile. Instead, there was something like recognition, a quiet understanding that perhaps Matt had faced similar battles himself. "You know," Matt said after a moment, leaning back in his chair as though gathering his thoughts, "people always think success comes easily, or that you've figured it all out once you've made it big. But the truth is, the hardest part isn't reaching the top, it's staying there. It's finding meaning in the midst of all the noise. It's remembering why you started in the first place." John's gaze shifted to his hands, still clasped tightly together on the table. He wasn't sure why he felt the need to open up in that moment, to let down the walls he'd so carefully constructed around himself. But something about Matt's words felt like a permission slip. For the first time in a long time, he felt seen, not for who he thought he was, or for the failures that weighed him down, but for the simple fact that he was a person, struggling just like everyone else. "You ever feel like it's too late to find a new dream?" John asked, the question slipping out before he could think better of it. He couldn't quite believe he had asked it, but now that it was out, there was no taking it back. Matt didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a long sip of his coffee, his eyes distant for a moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, measured, but there was a strength behind it, one that came from years of navigating his own inner battles. "No," he said slowly, "it's never too late. The dream doesn't die unless you let it. And sometimes the best thing you can do is just start over. Let go of the idea that everything has to be perfect. The truth is, we're all just figuring it out as we go." John nodded, unsure of how to respond, but he felt something stir within him, something that had been dormant for far too long. Matt had said something so simple, yet it felt profound. Perhaps, he thought, it wasn't too late after all. Perhaps he could find a way back to what he once loved. As they parted ways later, Matt's words lingered in John's mind like a whisper, a quiet beacon of possibility. For the first time in a long while, John didn't feel completely alone in his struggle. There was hope, however small, that maybe the pieces of his lost dream weren't as scattered as he had believed. In the days that followed his conversation with Matt Damon, John found himself caught in a quiet storm of reflection. He walked the city streets with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years, yet it wasn't the same restless drive that once led him to pursue his goals with feverish intensity. This time, it was different, gentler, quieter, as if he were tiptoeing towards something he hadn't yet fully named. Matt's words echoed in his mind like a steady hum, reminding him that the dream he thought was lost could still be found. But the more he pondered it, the more another question surfaced. What if he was wrong? What if the dream he was chasing wasn't really what he wanted after all? Success, fame, recognition. He had always been drawn to those things, almost as though they were the only valid markers of a life well lived. But now, the meaning of all those things felt hollow, as though they were just distractions from the true, deeper purpose that lay beneath. Matt had said that the hardest part wasn't reaching the top, it was staying there. But John couldn't help but wonder if the real challenge was even more fundamental than that. What happened when you reached the top, only to find that it didn't feel like anything you had imagined? What was the point of striving for success if the very act of achieving it left you feeling empty inside? Matt had offered a kind of wisdom John hadn't expected. He had shared his own struggles with John, revealing the cracks in the polished image of a life most people would envy. Matt spoke with a quiet candor, as if acknowledging that even those who had seemingly made it had their own doubts and insecurities, their own moments of feeling like imposters in their own skin. John thought about it for days. He replayed their conversation over and over, piecing together fragments of what Matt had said about the pressure of fame, the weight of expectations, the desire to maintain an image of success. It was a life he had once dreamed of, being recognized, being admired, but now, it seemed like a gilded cage. The more John reflected on it, the more he began to see that success, the way he had once defined it, wasn't the answer. It had never been the answer. He had spent so much of his life striving for things that seemed important in the moment, writing the perfect novel, landing the big job, impressing people with his achievements. But now, in the stillness of his own thoughts, he realized how much of it had been motivated by fear. Fear of failure, fear of not being enough, fear of being forgotten. It had taken years for him to admit it, but John had spent most of his adult life chasing an illusion of success, one that was dictated by other people's expectations, not his own. And that was where the real burden lay. He had built a life on the foundations of other people's dreams, and somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of his own. No matter how much he achieved, it never felt like enough. The constant pressure to succeed, to prove something to others, had consumed him, leaving little room to ask the most important question of all. What did he actually want? It was late one evening when John finally sat down to write again. The dim light of his desk lamp illuminated the empty pages of his notebook, a stark contrast to the pages that had once been filled with the promise of new ideas. He hadn't touched the pen in months, maybe longer, but now, with the weight of his reflections pressing against him, he felt compelled to try. He stared at the blank page for a long time. The words didn't come easily, but they began to form, slowly at first, like hesitant steps into a darkened room. He didn't know what he was writing at first, only that it felt necessary. The hardest part, he wrote, is not the dream itself, but letting go of the one you thought you wanted. John paused, his pen hovering over the page. The sentence felt both foreign and familiar, like something he had known all along but had never allowed himself to admit. He had spent so much time focusing on what he thought success looked like that he had missed the truth. It wasn't about the achievement itself, but about the process. It was about finding the courage to let go of the rigid idea of what he should be and instead allow himself to rediscover what he truly wanted without the weight of outside expectations. He looked at the words again. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. Maybe he could learn to write for himself again, not for anyone else, not for the critics or the accolades, but for the simple act of creation. The more he wrote, the more he began to realize something crucial. Matt's words had struck a chord because they weren't about giving up on dreams. They were about shifting perspective. Matt hadn't told him to stop striving for something bigger. He had simply reminded him that the pursuit needed to come from a place of authenticity. He hadn't been speaking about the external rewards that come with success, but the internal satisfaction that comes with truly knowing who you are and what you're meant to do. And in that moment, as the words began to flow more easily, John understood what he needed to do. He didn't need to achieve someone else's version of success. He needed to reconnect with the dream that had once been his own, before it had been corrupted by fear and expectation. The dream was still there, buried beneath the layers of self-doubt, waiting for him to uncover it. John continued to write well into the night, his mind alive with possibilities. The sentences began to form into paragraphs, then into chapters, and before he knew it, he was no longer sitting in his dimly lit apartment, but back in the world he had once inhabited, the world of creation, of endless potential, of a life filled with meaning. The pages filled with words that were no longer hollow or forced, but honest and real, words that were his own. He didn't know where it would lead, or if it would even make a difference in the grand scheme of things, but it didn't matter. For the first time in ages, he felt the flicker of hope, the kind that comes when you're doing something simply because it feels right, not because it's supposed to get you somewhere. The process was messy and imperfect, but it was his. And for the first time, that was enough. The weeks that followed John's quiet epiphany felt like a slow, methodical reclamation of his life. He wasn't ready to dive headfirst into some grand, ambitious new project, but the small steps he began to take felt monumental. He hadn't expected such a shift. He had anticipated that it would be an all-consuming rush, a sudden surge of clarity. But it wasn't like that. It was more like breathing again after years of holding your breath. Each inhale was a bit deeper, each exhale a little easier, and before long, the act of simply being felt like the greatest form of progress. Every morning, John woke up with a small sense of purpose. His routine had changed. The old apathy he once felt toward even the smallest tasks had been replaced with something softer, something less demanding, but more genuine. It wasn't about accomplishing everything in a single day. It was about creating space for himself to feel, to think, to do things that mattered to him on his own terms. For the first time in a long time, the idea of creating wasn't tainted by the pressure to succeed or prove anything to anyone. It was simply an act of reconnecting with himself. He started writing again, but this time, there were no expectations attached. No deadlines, no promises, no imagined readers he had to impress. He wrote for the sake of writing, for the joy of finding words that could capture the things that had been buried deep inside him. He rediscovered a rhythm he had long forgotten, one that wasn't about moving toward an end goal, but about enjoying the flow of the process itself. It wasn't about the product. It was about the act of creation, of breathing life into something that hadn't existed before. John found solace in the quiet moments of his day. He went for long walks through the city, observing the world around him as though for the first time. He noticed the way the sunlight glinted off the glass buildings, the laughter of children playing in the park, the intricate patterns in the cracks of the pavement. It was as though he had been living in a haze, unable to appreciate the beauty of ordinary life. Now, he saw it everywhere, the simplicity, the rhythm, the interconnectedness of all things. One afternoon, John sat down with his notebook at the same cafe where he had met Matt. It was becoming a kind of quiet sanctuary for him, a place where he could be alone with his thoughts without feeling isolated. As he sipped his coffee, lost in the act of writing, he saw a familiar face across the room. It was Matt Damon, again, sitting in his usual spot with his laptop. There was no fanfare this time, no buzz of recognition. Matt wasn't some distant figure or an icon, he was just a man, living his life in the same quiet way that John had begun to embrace. Without thinking too much about it, John stood up and made his way over to Matt's table. He wasn't sure if it was the right thing to do, if Matt would even remember him, but it felt like something he needed to do. To reconnect, if only for a moment. Matt looked up as John approached, his face lighting up with a faint but genuine smile. "Hey, good to see you again," he said, his voice warm but not overly enthusiastic. There was no sign of the Hollywood persona here, just a man who seemed comfortable in his own skin. "I hope I'm not interrupting," John said, standing awkwardly by the table. "Not at all," Matt replied, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Sit down. How have you been?" John hesitated before sitting down. The conversation, so casual and open, felt so different from the first time they met, when John had felt so lost in his own uncertainty. Now, there was a quiet certainty in him, even if he didn't yet have all the answers. "I've been better," John said after a moment, his voice thoughtful. "I've been writing. Not worrying about making it perfect, just writing. And I've been walking a lot, just taking things slow." Matt raised an eyebrow, clearly interested. "That sounds healthy." It's funny how we forget how to do the simple things. Walking, breathing, just being. John nodded. "Yeah, I think I spent so many years thinking I had to be moving at a certain pace, achieving certain things, that I lost sight of what actually mattered to me." Matt leaned back in his chair, considering his words before speaking. "You know, I've been there. I've had periods in my career when I was just chasing whatever came next. At first, it was exciting, getting new roles, new opportunities, but then I started to realize I wasn't really living. I was just running." John could see the depth in Matt's eyes as he spoke. The man who seemed to have everything, the career, the fame, the admiration, was telling him that even those things didn't hold the answers. He wasn't impervious to the pressures of life, to the weight of success. In fact, Matt seemed to be saying that the very pursuit of external achievements could sometimes pull you farther away from the things that truly mattered. "I think we're all running from something," Matt continued, his voice quieter now. "Maybe from the quiet, or from the fear of not doing enough. It's easy to get lost in that, to forget that we're human, not machines. We're not here to be perfect or to win the approval of others. We're just here to be." John absorbed the words, letting them sink in. For a moment, he said nothing, allowing the silence to fill the space between them. It wasn't uncomfortable. In fact, it felt like a moment of shared understanding. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said that day," John finally said, looking up at Matt. "About how the hardest part isn't reaching the top, but staying there. I think what I realized is that the top isn't really what I'm after. It's the act of being in motion, of creating something that feels true to me. That's what matters." Matt smiled softly. "That's the stuff that lasts, right? The real work isn't what you accomplish or how others perceive you. It's about showing up for yourself, writing that story, building something, sharing your truth." John took a deep breath, feeling something stir inside of him. There was a sense of peace in Matt's words, a kind of quiet assurance that had eluded him for so long. Matt wasn't offering a roadmap, and he wasn't pretending to have all the answers. But what he was offering was a kind of permission to stop chasing things that didn't matter and to instead pursue the things that felt true. "I think I'm starting to understand that," John said quietly, more to himself than to Matt. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't just surviving life, he was finally starting to live it. He didn't have all the answers, and he knew that there would still be moments of doubt, of uncertainty, but that was okay. He wasn't looking for perfection anymore. He was looking for truth, and that, in itself, felt like a new beginning. As John stood to leave, Matt gave him a nod, his expression thoughtful. "Take care, John. Don't forget to keep showing up for yourself." And with that, John walked out of the cafe, the weight of the world a little lighter on his shoulders, the flicker of possibility a little brighter in his chest. It wasn't about finding the perfect dream or achieving the impossible. It was about moving forward, step by step, at his own pace, towards something that felt like his own. He wasn't quite there yet, but he was getting closer every day. The months that followed felt like a quiet unfolding. John had stopped trying to force anything. He had given up on the idea that success, in its traditional form, would bring him happiness or fulfillment or meaning. He didn't wake up every morning with a rigid list of goals and deadlines. Instead, he woke up with a sense of curiosity about what the day might bring, what he might learn, what small piece of his soul might open up as he allowed himself to move through the world with less resistance. John had begun to write with more freedom. No longer driven by the pressure of perfection, he had started working on a novel that had been buried deep within him for years. It wasn't about the end result. It wasn't about getting published or receiving accolades. It was about telling a story that was true to him, The characters felt real to him now, not just figments of imagination, but people he could almost touch. His words were no longer forced or strained. They came more naturally, like the flow of a river finding its path. There were still moments of doubt, of course, moments when he would question if he was any good at all. But now, those doubts didn't have the same grip on him. They didn't control him the way they used to. He could let them come and go, acknowledging them without letting them dictate his actions. He found peace in the act of creating, and with it came a deeper understanding of what it meant to live authentically. His days were simpler now, but they were richer for it. There were no more grandiose dreams of fame or recognition. He didn't need those things anymore. What mattered was the quiet satisfaction of writing every morning, of walking through the city with his thoughts, of taking care of his mind and body, of living in the present moment. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. One crisp autumn morning, as John sat at his usual cafe, his notebook open before him, he was surprised to see a familiar face. Matt Damon had walked in, his presence still carrying the same quiet energy that had drawn John in the first time they met. This time, however, Matt wasn't sitting alone, and there was no formal greeting. The woman with him was laughing, her voice light and melodic. She was talking animatedly about something, and Matt listened, clearly engaged, his expression relaxed and comfortable. John watched them for a moment, a soft smile tugging at his lips. There was a peacefulness about Matt now that seemed even more profound than the first time they had spoken. The tension that had once been so palpable in his voice was gone, replaced by a warmth that made him seem like just another man, just another human being trying to navigate life. Matt's eyes met John's across the room, and once again, there was that small, knowing smile. No words passed between them, but it didn't matter. John felt that quiet recognition again, that connection that wasn't about fame or success, but about shared understanding. As the morning wore on, Matt and his companion finished their drinks and stood to leave. Matt caught John's eye one last time before walking toward the door, and in that brief moment, he nodded as though acknowledging a silent camaraderie. It wasn't about the things they had in common or the things they had accomplished. It was the unspoken understanding that both had chosen to live their lives in a way that honored their inner truth. No matter where they had come from, no matter what they had achieved or lost, they were both, in their own way, beginning anew. Later that afternoon, as John continued to write, he found himself reflecting on the many conversations he had had with people over the years. How many had been filled with expectations, with projections of what others thought he should be or do. But this, he realized, was different. His relationship with Matt wasn't based on anything external. It wasn't about measuring one life against another or comparing the outcomes of different paths. It was simply two people, recognizing in each other the shared experience of being human, of struggling, of searching for meaning and peace in a world that often seemed chaotic. John didn't need to chase after any more dreams. He had already found what he was looking for, not in the tangible achievements he had once thought he needed, but in the quiet act of creation, in the simplicity of being present, in the relationships that were not defined by status or success, but by mutual respect and understanding. The manuscript he had been working on, slowly but surely, began to take shape. Each chapter, each sentence, became a small act of personal redemption, a quiet reclamation of everything he had lost and everything he had forgotten. It was a piece of himself he could give to the world, but more importantly, it was something he could give to himself. One evening, when the manuscript was nearly finished, John sat on the couch, flipping through the pages, feeling a sense of accomplishment. It wasn't perfect, but it was his. Every word had come from his own heart, from his own experience, and that, he realized, was all that mattered. He thought about the conversations he had had with Matt, the things that had stayed with him, the quiet wisdom about embracing imperfection, the reminder that dreams are not about external rewards, but about the quiet satisfaction of doing something that feels right. It was a lesson he had internalized over time, not just as an idea, but as a way of life. The journey wasn't about achieving some grand, unattainable goal. It was about showing up for yourself, day after day, in whatever form that took. And in that moment, as he closed the manuscript and set it down on the table, John felt a sense of peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from crossing the finish line, but the kind that comes from realizing that the finish line isn't the point at all. It's the moments in between, the small victories, the quiet breakthroughs, the times when you finally listen to yourself and allow yourself to be who you truly are. There was no grand celebration, no fanfare, But there didn't need to be. The book, though not yet published, was the culmination of something much bigger than a finished manuscript. It was the realization that he could still dream, still create, still move forward, no matter what had come before. As he sat back and looked out the window, John understood that life, in all its complexities, wasn't about finding a singular, perfect path. It was about creating your own path, one small step at a time, with the courage to redefine what success meant to you. He didn't have all the answers, and he didn't need them. What mattered was that he was still moving, still growing, still finding his way, one day at a time. And that, he realized, was enough.